Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. This is the final session. The program says conclusion, roundtable discussion. That's misleading in two ways. First of all, this is not a roundtable. Despite Michael Rosen's heroic efforts to get everything in order, he did not make this rectangular table, into a round table. And conclusion, how could anyone conclude a conference of this magnificent luminosity? It's been quite extraordinary. I think everyone I've talked to agrees with that. It's an overlapping consensus because each person has his own or her own idea of what was the best part of it, and not only his or her own contribution too. So this is not a conclusion. This is a temporary ending. And before we even reach a temporary ending, I'm going to say what the agenda is and introduce briefly the speakers, because I trust you've all read the extensive biographies here, soon to be published. I asked each of the panelists in advance, I warned them, to speak for about 10 or 15 minutes, addressing the general question, what remains of value in roles and what should be rejected or transcended? More specifically, I asked them each to focus on one idea, insight, concept, principle, method that they think has stood the test of time and one that has not. And so we'll hear from each of them for 10 or 15 minutes apiece. We'll have a discussion among ourselves up here for about, depends on how it goes, for about 20 to 30 minutes. And then we'll open it up for a good, substantial piece of time for discussion, questions, but also opportunities for comments. This will be an opportunity for you actually, instead of pretending you were asking a question and making a comment. But here, you have license. So now, briefly, yeah, I shouldn't have said it. The order in which our panelists will speak are left to right. Teresa Bejan is an associate professor of political theory at Oxford. She's written on toleration, free speech, and civility, mere civility, I should say. Rainer Forst is professor of political theory and philosophy at Goethe University at Frankfurt. He's written on justice, toleration, the right to justification, and normativity and power. And Tommy Shelby, the Coleman Titcomb Professor of Philosophy and African American Studies here at Harvard. He's written on injustice in the ghetto, Black solidarity, Martin Luther King, and the philosophy of hip hop. Without further ado, I call on my panelists. First, Teresa, to begin.
Great. Well, thank you. It's an honor to be here among such luminaries. And thanks to Ludak and to Michael and the other organizers for giving me the opportunity. And also for giving me the last word. In my comments, I think I'd just really like to make explicit some of the questions I've been asking, maybe implicitly over the course of the conference. But I guess I should just start by observing that I'm not perhaps an obvious choice to invite to a conference on Rawls. As a political theorist and historian of political thought, I'm an early modernist by training, and Rainer will be the first to observe that I really have never gotten beyond the 17th century. So I really fell backwards into writing about Rawls. My own adolescent rebellion lasted well into grad school, as Andrew March, who's not here today, I don't think, but could have told you, and it expressed itself mainly in my refusal to read Rawls until I could no longer avoid it, that is, when I had to teach him to students. And perhaps that's why my own work has thus far focused on Rawls as a teacher and how he taught the tradition, as he called it, of political philosophy, and how he approached what he called the classic and enduring texts in the history of political thought. And in doing that, I'm drawing on his earliest lectures from the 1950s and 60s and the treasure trove of materials in the archive. And these materials reveal him to be a comprehensive and conscientious teacher of the tradition, and my hope that one of the benefits of historicizing Rawls will be that we begin to bring his own pedagogy back into the picture in understanding his political theory, its aspirations, and also its implementation. So some of the questions that Leif was talking about on the very first panel. The lectures are also incredibly endearing. His lecture notes reveal the familiar excitement of a young teacher who, in explaining a difficult work to his students, is forced to really read it for the first time. There's the delight of his philosophical jokes card catalog, which includes such gems as G.E. Moore's complaint to his wife that King George VI had never heard of Wittgenstein, or William James's synopsis of philosophy as the, quote, systematic misuse of a terminology expressly designed for that purpose, unquote. So, and they also contain smoking guns aplenty, for those of you who are into that kind of thing. So on the question of Rawls's Hegelianism, I offer you what I call the smoking Hegelian gun, namely his notes and lectures from the year 1960 that attest to Rawls's own engagement with the death of political philosophy debate kicked off by Laszlo, and also his enamorment with John Plominance and his 1960 article, The Use of Political Theory. So I'm just going to read you some of this. So, quote, if political philosophy seems quiescent today, it's because few practical political problems call for it. Communism is a matter of power. None are intellectually attracted to it. Similarly, according to Rawls in 1960, racial segregation, quote, has no moral defenders. It is a psychological and sociological problem of getting people to act as they overtly think they should. Thus, the leading political and social questions of the modern age are, in our country at least, in a sense resolved, unquote. He goes on to say, quote, there is no reason, perhaps, this is no reason, though, perhaps, for not discussing them. Hegel remarked in his preface to The Philosophy of Right that the owl of Minerva takes its flight only at dusk, by which he meant that wisdom was achieved only after a movement of thought had come to fruition. At this moment, he thought, the dry coldness of philosophical reflection brings to consciousness the logical structure of the preceding mode of thought in action. Well, perhaps just because these ideas and principles are so widely accepted by us, underlined, and the debate about them ostensibly turns more on matters of detail and application, we can afford, for the first time, to be rational in our examination of their structure and their relation to other political and social conclusions, unquote. And I'd just like to observe here that some of the points that Katrina raised about chronology, right, the sort of just so stories or received narratives we tell ourselves about the evolution of Rawls's thought, right, that there's a Hegelian turn later on, right, or that there's a political turn later on, are belied by papers in the archive that show he had been talking about these issues much, much earlier. And so it's just a question for you all, in your own teaching, how attached you are to those received narratives and what work they're doing. Anyway, so the immediate impetus for my turn to the historical Rawls was a conference that I put on in Oxford 2 years ago with my colleague Sophie Smith and Annette Zimmerman, who's now a postdoc at Princeton. And it's a conference that's now the subject of a journal special issue that's going to be entitled, quote, The Historical Rawls. I also just want to plump for our own swag. It was pretty good. But anyway, the motivating question, and don't worry, Dennis, I'm getting to your question. The motivating question for that conference and for the special issue was, for us, quote, what, if anything, changes when one reads Rawls as a figure in the history of political thought? And it led, I think, to a really productive discussion with our more analytically minded colleagues about not only the politics of political philosophy, in Katrina's phrase, but also the politics of the history of political thought, especially when it comes to the recently deceased. So anyway, so in preparing for this panel, as Dennis said, he asked us this question about what remains of value in Rawls and what should be rejected or transcended. And of course, another way of putting that question is to ask, what is living and what is dead in the political theory of John Rawls? And in that form, it's a question that was once asked by one of the leading founders of the Cambridge School, John Donne, of another giant in the history of political thought, also named John Locke. What is living and what is dead in the political theory of John Locke is the title of a really wonderful essay that Donne wrote in the 1980s as an apology, an explicit apology and retraction of the most incendiary sentence in his 1969 book, The Political Thought of John Locke. That book had excavated the Christian theological foundations of Lockean politics and ethics in what Donne later admitted was a spirit of debunking. Right? So he says in the introduction to that book, quote, "I simply cannot conceive of constructing an analysis of any issue in contemporary political theory around the affirmation or negation of anything which Locke says about political matters," unquote. That sentence, published by Donne at the tender age of 29, was a particularly bold statement of what was the explicit agenda of what would come to be called the Cambridge School, announced in what was the original title of Quentin Skinner's Meaning and Understanding in the History of Ideas. It started as a conference paper called On the Unimportance of the Great Texts, right? Because the historical Locke had built a holistic intellectual system on controversial theological foundations, we no longer share, Donne's argument ran, we cannot continue to help ourselves to the bits of his thought we like. Thus, the political thought of John Locke died with the death of God. In Skinner's memorable phrase, the time had come to do our thinking for ourselves. In the later essay, though, Donne retracts that sentence in full, and he admits its ludicrous confession of intellectual myopia, arguing that while parts of Locke's thought must indeed be dead for those who do not share his theological premises, much might be living still. Particularly, he thought Locke's chastened vision of the possibilities of the political. Of course, that apology didn't go far enough for people like Jeremy Waldron, for reasons that we heard a little bit about yesterday. And so Jeremy made this explicit in his 1999 Carlisle lectures that became God, Locke, and Equality. Anyway, so why am I belaboring this? Well, it seemed to me that the issues raised by Kenzie Bok and Eric Nelson in the discussion on the first panel track remarkably closely the trajectory of 20th century historical work on John Locke, who had become already a synecdoche for liberalism. And it seems to me that a lot of what we're talking about in what is living and what is dead in the thought of John Rawls is similarly a fight about how we're going to deal with historicizing Rawls, and even explicitly to the extent of to what extent was he really a Calvinist, right? Or some other kind of Christian, and what might those implications have for our understanding of his theory. I'll simply observe that Kenzie's question in the last panel was implicitly, it seemed to me, a question of the theological limits that we're assuming in our reading of Locke's political theory. And it was striking to me that, that her question really wasn't answered. So the question that we're being asked on this panel, that I have thus far avoided answering, what is living and what is dead in the thought of John Rawls, has been in the background, and now it's been made explicit. And I suspect one of the reasons that the question's been in the background thus far is an understandable hesitance on the part of those who knew and loved Jack Rawls to spare him from the indignities of intellectual history. But it also reflects a worry on the part of those who continue to think so productively within Rawls's framework, examples of which we saw yesterday and this morning, that parts of that framework, if we begin to think historically about them, might turn out to be dead, and they're parts that we cannot do without. So I certainly encounter colleagues who are suspicious of my motives in historicizing Rawls. Some suspect me of a personal animus, which is not the case. My historical work has made me appreciate him as a man and as a thinker just tremendously more. Also, some suspect me of historicist imperialism. So as one colleague at our conference put it, quote, "One reads Rawls to avoid reading history." So to treat Rawls as just another figure in the tradition, like Hobbes or Hegel, to be contextualized and criticized accordingly, suggests that his texts and tools are not enough, that they and our supposed emancipation from the tradition come with their own encumbrances that only historical awareness can bring to light. And although I'm not a methodological imperialist, it is true, if I had to choose what's dead or what should be dead in John Rawls, it's the original position, for the reasons that Leif mentioned in the first panel, but also because it's become this emblem of Rawlsian political philosophy as an ahistorical pursuit meant to emancipate the theorist from the tradition and its history and enable her to theorize justice anew, unencumbered by the past. Now, I don't think that's what Rawls actually thought or what he was up to with the original position. I'm sure many people here also agree that that's a bad characterization, but that's often how it's taught to students. In my own institution and elsewhere, and that is a mistake. Rawls was consistent, even obsessed, with alerting his students to political philosophy as an essentially traditional pursuit, one wherein we have no choice but to begin where we are, historically, but in which the beginning of philosophy must be an awareness of our own positionality and then a reflective curiosity about the conditions of our own philosophical activity. Right? I think that's a consummately Rawlsian thought. And so for me, what's most alive in Rawls's political philosophy at this historical moment is that he is dead. And that fact, on its own, has or should jolt us as political theorists, philosophers, and pedagogues into an awareness of our own positionality, institutional, temporal, historical, and the conditions of our own philosophical activity and its presumptive authority. So my interest in Rawls as teacher is arising out of earlier work on Hobbes as a theorist of education, which I was talking to Leif about. You know, I think Hobbes sort of has the edge on Rawls because he took care to offer the heuristic of the 10 Commandments for teaching the laws of nature in Leviathan. Hobbes actually gives a lot of thought to how Leviathan should be taught. His approach to decolonizing the curriculum was to remove all of Aristotle and replace it with Leviathan, famously. And, you know, we might laugh at that, but actually, I think Hobbes is really serious here in that it's not enough if you care about justice or peace to simply theorize about politics. You actually have to care about implementation and you have to care about pedagogy. You have to take concrete steps to think how your theory might be best taught and how it can meet this third publicity condition that Leif was talking about and that Rawls cared an awful lot about. And Hobbes's focus on the universities was not just typical navel gazing of the kind that other people in this room love to do, first and foremost myself. It's the thought that those who go through the universities become the teachers of the people, right? Specifically, they're the ones who will go and teach, but they're also the people who will go and preach. And above that, they're the people who are going to occupy positions of power and authority, what we might call cultural influencing today, and that will then be exemplars to the people. And so for Hobbes, his diagnosis of the English Civil War was that it was the result of a miseducation of the Commonwealth that could be traced back to the miseducation of her elites in the universities of that country. So it was farcical to theorize about justice without thinking about educational reform and how you teach the elites' political philosophy. So to return to the themes raised by Sam in his talk yesterday, it may be the case that recent political events are not due to a failure of liberal political theory, but I think it's an open question how much of it is to do with a failure of liberal pedagogy. And I think it would be a damned shame if we were to conclude this conference without having a discussion about our own positionality and our own preeminence in institutions like this one or the one in which I teach, Oxford, right? Because the pose of powerlessness on our part is not simply incredible, it's unbecoming. And it risks turning into a kind of studied indifference or lack of awareness that then begins to become a kind of irresponsibility. So anyway, so that's my challenge. That's what I would like to talk about. But thank you.
I want to start by thanking Michael, Ludek, and Danielle for organizing this wonderful conference and for having me here. It's a real treat for a number of reasons. one minor personal reason is that it also gives me a chance to celebrate my own 30th anniversary. It was exactly 30 years ago that I first came here to do research on theories of justice, liberalism, and communitarianism. And John Rawls and Tim Scanlon were so kind to receive me. And after this, almost every year I came back for some longer periods of time. So I was a wanderer between two worlds, the Kantian Harvard world and the Kantian Frankfurt world. And during that time, the one wrote Political Liberalism, the other, my advisor, wrote the book Between Facts and Norms, and for a young scholar, or not yet scholar, just student, that was just a wonderful time. So this also gives me a chance to say thank you to the great people who hosted me in memory of one of them. So within 10 minutes, what remains and what should go? I thought about possible titles for if I had more time to speak, and I promised Dennis, a German that I am, that I'd be brief and only need an hour for the exposition and stop after that. The titles would be A Pure Theory of Justice, in a way the anti-Kelsen, and I'll explain a bit what I mean by a pure theory, and then add with two remarks about impurity, and both of them are critical of Rawls, but I'll praise him first. Another title could simply be A Note from Prussia. So just to indicate where this is going, and to avoid having Teresa scold me for for lack of historical consciousness. So I hardly ever disagree with Tim, but I think in what I want to praise Rawls for, I praise him for exactly what Tim was critical of, namely the unified and in fact the monolithic character of that towering theory. I think every towering theory in philosophy develops one big idea, one single idea in a complex and fascinating way. And basically, as a footnote to Steve Darwell's wonderful talk, I think the main idea that Rawls developed so beautifully was to use a Kantian notion of autonomy and apply it to the basic structure of a society, which is something that Kant had not done, apart from some rather revisionist readings of Kantian legal philosophy. So I go back, if I may, to the classic quote from A Theory of Justice, where Rawls says, "The original position may be viewed as a procedural interpretation of Kant's conception of autonomy and the categorical imperative within the framework of an empirical theory. The main normative idea that the whole theory develops rests on, and which leads Rawls to say that the principles of justice are categorical imperatives, is the idea that these principles ought to express our, I almost said, nature as autonomous, moral and political beings, as equal normative authorities, to use the authority term that Steve Darwell explained so well in his book, authorities who construct together in mutual justification processes the principles that should guide their basic social structure, so that within that structure they remain autonomous norm givers and are never subject to structures or institutions where they are not norm givers and at the same time attrices and subjects of the law. This has a lot of implications for the things we talked about these past days. How do we understand the basic liberties and basic rights? How do we understand the social and economic institutions that establish what Rawls calls a system of pure procedural justice? In realizing the difference principle, he thinks we will avoid the production of a class of the worst off, of a permanent class of the worst off who are in need of receiving redistribution. So the autonomy, I think, means that being a full member of a scheme of social cooperation, you're always a contributing and receiving agent, but you're never merely a receiving agent. Being part of a complex of justice doesn't mean that some distributor, hands you over some goods. It means that with your capacities, you are a fully cooperating member. That is the ideal of justice here. If the way Rawls develops this idea of autonomy as a moral idea and then what it means in political, legal, and social terms, the way he develops this, then the other values, liberty, equality, fall into place. But it's always from that idea how he develops this. And that has an anti-pluralist, in Tim's sense, anti-pluralist structure and character. And I'm sorry, the Prussian that I am, that's the character I admire. That, I think, is how Rawls's theory stands out as a monolithic, as a monument within the history of political philosophy. One important aspect of that theory is not just that it tries to spell out what it means to be an autonomous lawgiver and law atrocity in a basic structure of society, but that the theory itself is an autonomous theory. What can that mean? It means that the theory is not built on a heteronomous set of considerations like maximum utility or other notions of the good. So what is it built on? It's built on a reconsideration, on a reconstruction of us as autonomous beings using practical reason to establish a basic structure, a normative order that we can reasonably justify towards each other as equal normative authorities. Some think that political liberalism was a turn away from that essentially Kantian character of the theory. And that's partly right and mostly wrong. It's partly right because, as Paul in his wonderful book explained, Rawls thought that the way he understood the congruence of the right and the good went too far. Also, the metaphysical implications of a thoroughly Kantian view, he thought, would carry the idea of what construction of norms means too far, as if it is, a way of making norms that would exclude moral realism. So I see that. But look, if you read political liberalism, the notion that this is a freestanding conception of justice is all over the place, and that it is an autonomous conception of justice that tries to shed itself from being a comprehensive doctrine or a partial comprehensive doctrine. And so I think political liberalism is to be seen as the radicalization of the attempt to establish an autonomous political conception of justice, and that's what Rawls calls doctrinal autonomy. And I quote from the lecture on political constructivism, the 3rd chapter of Political Liberalism. Constructivism enables us to state the meaning of an autonomous political doctrine as one that represents or displays the political principles of justice as reached by using the principles of practical reason in union with the appropriate conceptions of persons as free and equal and of society as a fair system of cooperation. That idea of the person and of social cooperation he calls conceptions, sometimes in the book ideas of practical reason. And therefore, he says, in affirming the political doctrine as a whole, we, as citizens, are ourselves autonomous, politically speaking. So the idea of autonomy of the citizens in a well-ordered society and of the autonomy of the theory cohere. They form a unity. That's how we understand the elegance and the structure, and I'll come to an end, of Rawls's approach. But I said at the outset, apart from praising the purity of that theory and the wealth of insights there are two notions of impurity that I will critically make a remark on. Here's impurity one. Even though the Kantian character of the approach, I think, is obvious, and the moral nature of the conception of justice is stressed many times, and such as when he calls the political conception having an intrinsic normative and moral ideal. Still, Rawls did not sufficiently explain what it means to think of a Kantian constructivist approach that he himself uses in a non-metaphysical and non-comprehensive but still moral way. The term moral appears in two versions in the book, which are not distinguished properly. There is the moral that is an attribute of the political conception, and the moral that is an attribute of comprehensive doctrines. These two must be distinguished, because the political conception has to be a moral conception in its own right. It cannot borrow its moral force from comprehensive doctrines, as the overlapping consensus in one reading seems to suggest. But that can't be the case, because remember, the political conception and its notion of reasonableness itself autonomously defines which comprehensive doctrine is reasonable and which is not. It takes priority over the comprehensive doctrines. It cannot borrow its moral force from any or some overlap of the comprehensive doctrines. But that leads to the constraints on practical reason that Jeremy was critical of, and so on. Lots of complications. But Rawls didn't give us the whole story about the priority of a non-metaphysical, political, but still moral conception of justice, and therefore the impurity I'm critical of invites a heteronymous reading of the theory that wants to be autonomous. Final word. Second impurity, and that one, here's the criticism, is a little different. Not that Rawls is too impure, but that he strives for a purity we should not strive for. What do I mean? The one advantage of having such a Kantian scheme of normative authority, of autonomy, and apply it to the basic structure of society is that you can place it in the contexts of a given social society or a normative order that is larger than one society. We then ask the question of justice is, what does it mean for those who are subject to a normative order that they could become the normative authorities determining that order? That then is the question of justice. But Rawls, when he considered, and I think this reflected in the discussions, especially yesterday, when he considers what the normative order is in which we ought to become normative authorities, he did not transcend the framework of the nation state. And where he did, in the Law of Peoples, it was not a terribly successful attempt, because the distinction between a national form of justice and an international form does not do justice to the transnational quality of our economic reality, of global financial capitalism, of thoroughly globalized chains of production, and what is euphemistically called cooperation, not to mention the massive transnational migration reflecting deep injustices and inequalities of social conditions worldwide. We talked about it over dinner last night. So the question of our well-ordered society, whether, property owning or democratically socialist or whatever, is no longer our question, if by our we mean a nation-state political community. That is, I think, the wrong way to ask a question. Last word, to refer to the very first wonderful panel. A political philosophy that wants to have a future, and that should have a future, cannot reproduce a social imaginary that we found in the beautiful quote where Rawls says, I'm not happy with globalization, I prefer the million statist ideal. Yes, he did prefer that, but look, if you want a theory of justice that speaks to the injustices of our world, that framework can no longer be used. And to long for it is a false longing for a purity we cannot have again. The question of justice is no longer our question if we mean Americans, German, or Brits. These days are gone. Thank you.
So thanks. Very glad to be here, honored to be here. First, of course, thanks to Michael and Danielle, Ludic, and of course the SAFRA staff. I don't know, I don't see them now, but who helped to put this conference on. It's been great, and I've learned a lot. I'm not sure why I'm on this panel, but I mean, I wasn't a student of Rawls. I never met Rawls. I don't think of myself as like an expert on Rawls's thought. I don't claim to have sort of mastered the philosophical system. I have, of course, been deeply influenced by his thought, reading his books, reading engagements with what he does. My own work tends to focus on questions of racial justice, economic justice, and criminal justice, and I've used some ideas from his work to try to help me think through some of those issues. But probably I think of myself at least as influenced as much by other traditions of thought, whether that be Marxism or the Black radical tradition or feminism, and I think of myself in a lot of ways as trying to, you know, make my way toward a political philosophy that integrates insights from all four of those traditions. So the remarks I make can be understood kind of in that, against that background. So on the question of kind of what I think endures, so one of the ideas in Rawls's work that I rely on, and one that I think at least one of the ways in which it's a distinctive brand of liberal egalitarianism is the way in which he uses the idea of the basic structure. So let me start with this, how he characterizes it. This is from Political Liberalism. He says, the basic structure is understood as the way in which the major social institutions fit together into one system and how they assign fundamental rights and duties and shape the division of advantages that arises through social cooperation. So that's the characterization. Now across his work as I read it, he gives actually a lot of different reasons for focusing on the basic structure. And I thought maybe I could say something about, maybe I'll sort these reasons into three types and say something about quickly about each one and about why I'm kind of drawn to keeping this idea of a focus on the basic structure. So what are those three types of reasons? One has to do with kind of the moral significance of the basic structure. One has to do with the sort of, if you like, social theoretic significance of the idea, and one sort of methodological. So, you know, Rawls will say that the basic structure is the primary subject of justice, and one way of taking that is to read it as a meaning something like it has a kind of certain fundamental moral significance, right? And this, I take it, is he gives lots of reasons for this. One reason he emphasizes, and you see in the early work and in the later work, is that because it has, as he sometimes puts, a pervasive and lifelong effect on citizens in lots of different ways. Among those ways are it affects their basic aims, affects their character, affects the opportunities that they have, and it affects their abilities to make use of those opportunities. So it has this kind of huge and kind of inescapable impact on who we become, right? And on our basic ambitions in life, and it affects, you know, what we can do and what we can accomplish in a life, right? And presumably is reason enough to focus on. He gives other reasons, but that's one that you see emphasized throughout. Now, recall that Rawls conceives of a society, conceives of society itself as a system of social cooperation over time, as people have emphasized at various points throughout the conference. And so that allows us to ask a question, right, about whether the system is fair to all who have to live under it. Where sort of you find yourself in it, and it has this huge impact on you, and then you have to, and all kinds of questions will arise. Among them, was the system fair? But there's also there's a kind of social theoretic significance, I think, to focusing on the basic structure. It sometimes comes out, I think, and Samuel Freeman has tendency to emphasize this, the idea that institutions of the basic structure, these are the ones that make fruitful social cooperation across generations possible. It's a way of thinking about, you got this idea of what a society is, and then you got this idea of like these institutions that play this role, right, in making fruitful cooperation possible, and then you can raise these questions about how to distribute the advantages of that cooperation, right? So that's a kind of way of conceptualizing things that I think is kind of theoretical, and I think is important to how he thinks about things, and it's something that others in the broader liberal tradition, some of them don't accept. Let me turn to the methodological reason, which I've only recently been thinking about. So here, the focus on the basic structure, I take, sometimes Rawls will use language. Somebody says, well, it's the primary subject. Somebody says it's the first subject. So let me talk about why it's the first subject for a minute, because I think it's methodologically interesting. So I think the thought is something like this. Well, we need to know which principles of justice should regulate the basic structure before we can gain a kind of systematic grasp on the other subjects of justice. I think that's the kind of broader thought, right? So he doesn't just think, he thinks there are lots of different types of principles of justice. There are different subjects, things you could be focusing on. You could be focusing on the basic structure, you could be focusing on international relations, might be focusing on institutions and associations and so on, right? But, or as we talked about in the last panel, about relations to future generations, all these different subjects of justice, and depending on which one you're taking up, you're going to come to different types of principles. But I take it that the methodological point is something like, well, you need to sort of start with the justice of the basic structure, and that allows you to gain traction on these other questions. I take it that's the way he's thinking of it. So justice of the basic structure is not the only question of justice, right? But Rawls thinks it sort of has a kind of methodological priority in helping us gain traction on other justice questions. So for example, he'll say he thinks that a just basic structure secures background justice. What's the thought there? I take it as something like, there are a bunch of questions, a bunch of justice questions that arise between individual interactions or things that happen within our organization and so on. There are justice questions that arise there too, but some of them we can't really understand unless we have a sense of how just or unjust the background structure is. So we might not know what a fair wage is, for instance, until we have a better sense of kind of the background justice question. So methodologically, you want to like get a fix on that, and then these other questions you can get clarity about. So that's kind of methodological. So I think all these are good reasons to focus on the basic structure. But let me maybe perhaps emphasize a reason for the focus for this focus that Rawls doesn't emphasize that much. But part of the reason why I was kind of drawn to maybe sorry to be autobiographical, but maybe about why I was kind of drawn to this picture. So I think the individuals, particularly those who believe that they themselves are oppressed, they have to kind of figure out how to sort of orient themselves to the broader social system. They got to think about how they're going to kind of relate to the overall social arrangement, as a whole, right? And not just the particular institutions within it. And so they have to decide, are they going to comply with it? Are they going to support it? Are they going to make an effort to work with others to try to reform it? Are they going to try to bring it down? Are they going to try to rebel against it, defy the claims that it's making on them? Are they going to try to leave it if they can? Those kinds of questions make much more sense against the background of the thought that there is a thing that is the basic structure that they're trying to evaluate so they can make those kinds of tough decisions. Right? And I think that it arises very easily in the Black tradition and other traditions like that to have that question. And I think Rawls's focus on the basic structure is one of the reasons that it was attractive to me. And I think another reason why I think it should endure. Ever since Dennis wrote us all and said, what's the thing that you think needs to go? And I've been like, tearing my hair, like, what needs to go? What needs to go? And it's not my tendency is probably not to think about Rawls like that. I tend to think like they're like, when I think about the various core ideas there that he emphasizes all the time, I mostly think, the ones I've given any serious thought to, some of them I haven't, you know, I might quibble about it or whatnot and want to develop it, but I don't feel like that's totally wrong-headed. So I really have that kind of reaction to them. But there are parts that I sort of feel like, and I'm limited to one, so I'll just mention one, that I think could use much greater development for the people who continue to find his thought illuminating and something they want to build on. So maybe just a quick word about that, and maybe it'll open into some discussion, because I know people here have thought more about this than I have. So I mentioned like the Marxist Black radical feminist traditions. So all of these traditions are deeply interested in preventing, among other things, the powerful from exploiting the labor of others. All those traditions have that, I think, in common. They want a social arrangement that doesn't enable involuntary servitude under despotic rule. They're all trying to eliminate that. This isn't part of the experience of workers, certainly people of African descent and women, all sorts. They want a social system that ensures that all who are able to can contribute their fair share to reproducing, if you like, the material conditions of life. Everybody has to pay their part. There are times in which Rawls, he emphasizes that, but he mostly talks about the distribution of the advantages and less about the distribution of the work that needs to be done, though he does acknowledge that as well. And so I think I've been impressed by, you know, by various feminist things. He allows, for instance, that the family law should be a part of the basic structure, and it's needed to ensure equitable sharing of work between men and women. And he thinks of labor law as a part of the basic structure. He emphasizes that. And so it raises some questions about whether, say, labor law, for instance, should be thought of as a part of the basic structure, and if so, how that should be developed. And I think that's one place I think would be nice to see. There is work on that, and there should be more work on that. And now Rawls, most of when he's talking about the basic structure, focuses on things like the property scheme, competitive markets, the Constitution, things like that. And those obviously super important. But says a lot less about work and how we ought to think about it. So he does insist, for instance, here's a quote, all citizens are to do their part in society's cooperative work, for instance. And he also emphasizes, even very early on, the importance of fairly sharing the burdens of cooperation. But you know, in this focus on the distribution of advantages, you know, he says very little. I think he has some reasons. Maybe we'll get into those. But he says very little about the principles that should govern how work ought to be organized and how work ought to be divided. Now, maybe he thinks of that as something that would only arise in what he calls local justice, like after you settled the questions about the basic structure, then you take up those questions, like he says about labor unions and so on. I'm not sure that's the right way to think about it, but I do think this is a place I'd like to see, you know, a lot more work. I'm gonna call Lucas. Lucas worked on this. Gina's worked on it, and other directions, thinking about the place of work, how it ought to be structured in terms of authority, and the burdens that have to be carried by us all. What are the principles that should structure that? And I'd love to see a lot more work on that. It's not exactly like you're wrong, Rawls, but it is a kind of call for people working in tradition to do more work on the topic. I'll stop with that. Thanks.
Teresa mentioned that paradoxically, one of the contributions of Rawls, the reason he's most alive is that he's dead. And it reminded me, we had many events here when Rawls was still alive, many in the Ethics Center, And panelists like this would sit there and discuss Rawls and say, Rawls would have said this, what Rawls would have said that. And Rawls was sitting right there, where you are, Frank, actually. You'd always sit back. And there was a temptation to turn to him and say, what would you, actually, this isn't hypothetical, what would you say? And he wouldn't say anything at that point. So he must have recognized already what Teresa has now reminded us of, is that it helps that we're talking about a philosopher whose work is complete and not, now, as soon as I say that, I realized that he himself never thought his work was complete. So as long as he was alive, he was revising. He'd already written a proposal to his publisher to do another edition of Political Liberalism when he was struck down with this illness. So also picking up on Teresa, I want to sort of provoke the panelists by asking, what would, you mentioned pedagogy, what would you want to teach, your approach to teaching Rawls, assuming he's worth teaching, and none of you have denied that. And I think there are real tensions here on the panel. Teresa, I think, would teach, and I'm going to ask you to respond, the historical, she would historicize Rawls. It would, the context, the early Rawls, the later Rawls, the world in which he was writing, the way it influenced what he was writing, how his own work derived from or was influenced by his predecessors. The effect of which, and this may be unfair, would be to particularize as well as historicize. Rawls would be much more pluralistic and less unified on your approach to teaching. Whereas Reiner, in stark contrast, would teach Rawls as Kant. Now, which raises the question of what's living and dead in Kant.
Rawls.
Rawls is what's living in Kant, right? But I take it you would, and maybe you actually do, teach Rawls as a unified theory. The pieces fit together, and that's the beauty and insight of it. The only thing did occur to me, one of the impurities that you thought Rawls should have recognized and not tried to unify is a little tension. And the globalization idea, it seems to me, if you tried to put that into the unified theory would be a little less unified. Right. And Tommy, I think, is sort of in between. The basic structure is a unifying way of teaching Rawls. And you could do the whole Rawls course with the basic structure. But you would, I would take it, defer to Teresa's historicism in at least one respect, in that the context, and so in your own work, social science and sociology has played an important role. And so while you might not want to historicize Rawls, you would want to relate him to contemporary social science and the problems of, say, the ghetto, which you've written about. So we've got three, as I've stylized it here, three different approaches to teaching Rawls. And my question is not only how would you teach Rawls, but how would you teach Rawls that's different, Teresa, from the way Reiner would teach Rawls, and Reiner from the way you would teach it, from the way Tommy would teach it. So let's have a curriculum argument here.
I'm so edified that my point about the questions of curriculum design as being foundational to the discipline seems to be being accepted. So this is.
I didn't accept it.
Okay, for the sake of argument. For the sake of argument. Well, this is. I mean, I think it's a wonderful question. And I guess Reiner doesn't believe me, but I insist always that I'm not a historicist. I'm a shameless presentist in the way that I approach the history of political thought. But it is the case that I am quite happy and quite adamant that we should approach Rawls as a figure in the history of political thought. That there's a lot of value added in doing this. I mean, one thing to say is that it allows us, I think, to be more creative in how we approach his texts and who we put him in dialogue with. I mean, I thought Danielle's presentation the other day of putting Rawls in dialogue with his contemporary, Ellison, it was tremendous, right? I learned a lot. I hadn't thought of it that way. History of political thought allows you to be much more open with respect to genre in terms of the kinds of things we teach. But I guess this is something I've become a lot more sensitive to. You know, I'm an American who was trained in the United States and in Britain, and then my first job was in Canada, and I've subsequently moved back to the UK. And what's really striking to me as an American is how indifferent my colleagues there seem to be of the implicitly American form of so much normative analytic political philosophy. And I think about the figures, just sociologically, the figures of Rawls and Dworkin as Americans who spent time and liked being in Oxford, had many colleagues in Oxford, you know, and Dworkin as this seminal figure, and just how indifferent we can be to the implicitly American institutional framework that is informing the normative theorizing. So I'll give two examples. In the teaching of questions of toleration and church-state separation, just the fact of disestablishment is being taken as the sort of normative model. And of course, we're dealing in a society where the fact that the established Church of England remains established is quite important. So that's one respect. The other respect is when it comes to issues of freedom of speech and the priority of a very individualistic understanding of free speech rights modeled on the First Amendment, which is, I say, a pretty poor framework for understanding most of the questions we care about when we talk about free speech today. But certainly it's a terrible framework when you're talking about questions of free speech in the United Kingdom, for example. So when I say kind of becoming aware of those conditions, I mean, part of just historicizing this is just to remind students of, you know, these are people from places who existed in time and are illustrating, they're abstracting from concrete institutional relationships, so arrangements, that are then not articulated in the theory. And of course, Dworkin and the Supreme Court is a tremendous example here, and the institution of judicial review. So I think sometimes my colleagues are suspicious of me as some kind of imperialist, as I said. I'm really, really not. My point simply is that you're getting a really incomplete understanding of the theories in question if you are indifferent to these kinds of questions of context. So that's how I would teach Rawls.
Reiner, how would you do it differently?
Well,
Or
probably
maybe not. Maybe I've exaggerated the difference.
He do it exactly the same as I would.
I would do exactly what Teresa does in my own way, which is, look, you can teach Rawls in many ways. You can use Theory of Justice or some of the other books in a course which only speaks to contemporary alternative theories, perfectionist ones, socialist ones. So it depends on whether it's on distributive justice or toleration whatsoever, and it works beautifully. To fully understand Rawls, I think you ought to include the historical discourses that he was part of, how in his thinking about distributive justice and structural justice, which is important, he had a dialogue with Marx. He had a dialogue with other thinkers who thought hard about structural injustice. In my own work on toleration, I thought I had an eye-opener in understanding when Rawls talks about the two components of a reasonable view, the burdens of reason, so an epistemological and a normative one, I had an eye-opener in seeing that some theories of toleration long time ago, 17th century, which is Teresa's period, had very similar approaches, like Pierre Bayle. And as Teresa found in the archives, Rawls actually had read Bayle, though he doesn't cite him. He cites his opponent, Bossuet, in that footnote. But it works in many ways. But for the full understanding of what Rawls was up to, not to see how he used and transformed Kant, I think, is a mistake. In the same way, how he relates to Mill, how he relates to Locke or to Marx. But we honor a great thinker in going further. He honors Kant in going further. We have slightly different questions, and in answering these questions, we have different things to take into account. So like Danielle, Leif, Sam, many of our other colleagues, I think we have to use this theory as a response to the injustices that we think exist in our societies, which means that we also have to have an idea of what, the structural realities of our time are. And so to address the issue of globalization is a task. You have to think about the basic structure as not one, but you have to have terms for the basic structure within a state and for the structures beyond the state which co-determine the basic structure within your state. Just think about how an economy today works. What is the basic structure of that economy, right? If you focus on that. So I think that is a task for us. It's not an either or. For a time it has been discussed that either you have a global basic structure or just national ones. This is not the right alternative, right? So I think the task is to think with Rawls, beyond Rawls, when it comes to these issues about how to make use of that theory, how to update it, and how to revise it both normatively and with respect to the structural realities we're part of.
There are lots of ways to teach Rawls. Wouldn't want to police how people do it, and people can teach it in a historical way. I probably would teach it rather differently, because I think when I teach other historical figures, whether that's Marx or Du Bois or whoever it is, I sort of basically I see them as people trying to answer questions that I'm trying to answer. I mean, it's partly what my interest in them, right? So in the case of Rawls, I'm interested in, well, as I think we all are, in what justice requires and how we should respond to injustice. And so I'm whether it's Rawls or any other figure that I'm teaching them with the view toward helping me answer those questions and see if I can learn something from them. When you think about the way Rawls does, you read his lectures on political philosophy, I think that's the way he approached it. He's like sees them as, insofar as they were asking those similar questions, like what can you gain from them? What can you learn? Not looking so much to tear them down or whatever, but what kind of insights can you draw as we grapple with these very hard questions that are kind of inescapable we have to deal with. So that's I will probably, as I tend to do things much more ahistorical, if you like, and less focus on in this case the man and his mind, but more so drawing from his writings and reading them charitably and trying to give a reconstruction in a way that puts them in their best light, so as to help me come to a firmer view about what I ought to think.
Good. Well, the question, though, it's persisting, at least in my mind. What I put it in terms of what we would teach, or how we would teach Rawls, but the corollary of that is who is his audience, and who was Rawls trying to teach, as it were. And sometimes we get the impression that it's other philosophers. It's certainly his generous footnoting and appreciation of not only historical figures, but some of you and some of us appear in footnotes, as if the dialogue is with other philosophers. And but that, I think, misrepresents his own aim. I was struck by something in the archives, again. He did an interview with the student magazine, the Harvard Review, the famous Harvard Review of Philosophy, which I think I don't think it's published anymore, is it? It is. It's here. So it is. The interview was, the student interviewer was asked him, what's all this for? And he said, in a democratic society as ours is, although it distressingly falls short of what it should be, I see political philosophy as addressing the citizenry, not the government. I'd put in brackets, not necessarily other philosophers. The citizenry, if they find your ideas convincing, you might change society for the better, or then characteristically modest roles, or more realistically, perhaps you might prevent it from getting worse. It's a beautiful little extemporaneous comment, and it does show that his dialogue was not only, I think, with historical figures, not only with other philosophers, not only with the power elite, but with citizens. So it's a deeply democratic notion of the purpose of philosophy, which sometimes I think we forget. I know I'm guilty of this too. Reaction?
Yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly. And I would actually, just to say, because, I made the comparison to Hobbes in my remarks, I think Hobbes's concerns are, Richard Tuck's not here, so are democratic in a way. It's not that he's particularly concerned to persuade the elites. He just sees this is the existing institutional arrangement whereby popular education happens. That's how the ideas in Leviathan will be disseminated. And one way that you can tell that he's thinking about this is the attention to images. So not only the famous cover image, but also the use of this terrifying images of the state of nature in that work. The body, the idea that he's trying to capture the theory in memorable images that can make an impression even if you never read the book. And I'd say that Hobbes was pretty damn successful at that. I think Rawls was less successful. And I think that's a shame because it's a failure, I think, on his own part for the reasons that you mentioned and that Leif brought out. He clearly has that Hobbesian, Aristotelian, Platonic sensitivity to the importance of teaching and the importance of political philosophy as being for the creation of a particular kind of society. And I think that there's a failure. There's a fundamental failure in the way that the philosophy has been communicated. And I just say, I think that, Tommy, the space between us is shorter than you think. I admit it, I did my master's at Cambridge, and I had to sort of confess to Quentin Skinner that my undergraduate advisor was Nathan Tarkoff at the University of Chicago. So I'm trained by Straussians. And so I'm very much a kind of permanent problems kind of girl, and that's something that appeals to me in Rawls. He's talking about someone like Hobbes. He's talking about someone like Locke because he's thinking of them as brilliant minds that are confronting sort of particular problems. And it's not the only way. They're not the only people to talk to by any stretch of the imagination. But you are in some way falling short, or the project is really incomplete if you fail to appreciate what's come before. So he's very, very traditionalist in his understanding, and I will confess that I find that appealing. I think others might feel differently.
Yeah, just briefly, I think political philosophy has not one audience; it has many audiences. When you write a philosophical book, obviously in dialogue with your colleagues, past and present, possible future, to refer to the discussion earlier. So you try to anticipate counter-arguments that haven't even been made. So that's definitely one audience. But the other audience, and I think this is what Rawls meant, is everyone who is seriously interested in a question like toleration, like social justice, where you hope your arguments are accessible to him or her. I don't think Rawls was a failure as in trying to communicate with the general public, as Teresa says. And the interesting thing is that precisely because he did not make a lot of efforts to communicate with the wider public, unlike other philosophers who, as public intellectuals, phrase their views for broader audiences. He hardly ever did that. But if you look at the influence that Rawls had, not just in various disciplines, but in legal discourse, Frank is the expert on this, some others here, Sam, it is astounding how much he has been received without, touring from law school to law school, telling them, this is what I think, this is what it means for you, and so on. He was very reluctant to tell people how to apply their theories. He also did not go to think tanks to invite people to think about what it meant to realize the difference principle. And I think, given that, it must be a virtue of the thought, of the clarity of the thought, and the conclusions he draw, how much of an influence it had. We have been discussing this earlier also, Tim brought it up. Rawls has also often been misunderstood in the wider, not just among philosophers, but in the wider public. So the trickle-down interpretation of the difference principle is an obvious case in that regard, and often he has been misread as if he presented just the better version of the US. So it's on its way to become a well-ordered society. So maybe I'm, as a critical theorist, I have a, fatal problem in reading theories that way. I think it's a radical criticism of not just American, but also many Western societies. And in the few passages when he actually spoke about the justice of existing situations, the formulations were quite drastic. So that is an obvious misreading. Coming from Germany, I'll stop here. It's great fun to teach Rawls. There are very few books in political philosophy which it is as much fun to teach. Hobbes is, a rival, I think, and that says something about the gravity of a theory of justice. But for a group of Frankfurt students, when they hit upon that book and read, oh, this is the best liberal theory of justice around, they think, really, liberalism, what does that have to do with justice? So my Frankfurt radicals, you have to make a number of steps to open their minds and hearts to what liberalism means for Rawls. And I think in France and in other countries, it's quite similar. So the contextual reconstruction of the reception of Rawls has to take into account these different contexts and what liberalism means here and what it means in other parts of the world. So there's still much more ground to cover and lots of more reception to come in a number of different cultural and social contexts.
Very interesting. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I just want to sort of take issue with just sort of two things that you said, and not in a friendly way. I mean, the first issue is I'm not saying that that Rawls failed in being taken up. I think he's been taken up by elites who continue to operate in a very top-down way. His being taken up by judges and jurists is precisely evidence of the phenomenon as I see it. I mean, the second point would be, I do think that there remains from the beginning a very important and strong Hegelian strand, and I mean, I read that passage for a reason, which does see, I think he retreats from this, but originally does see what he's doing as spelling out rationally an idealized American constitutional, secular, liberal democracy on the model of America under the Warren Court. And I think that remains very much the ideal, the sort of telos with which he's working.
It does not fit to the socialism that he thought was, the conclusion of his theory. That's only part of that. That's sorry, I didn't mean to, I didn't. Sorry, but that's because people focus on the constitutional issues, on the legal parts, where you think you have an idea of the institutional form that he has in mind. But we're so far from anything remotely from the social structure and the social institutions he had in mind that I think this is at best half of the story. So,
Tommy?
What Reiner said, basically. But I mean, one thing I would say about speaking to the public, it's a thing like, amongst, Black intellectuals, this is like a standing issue of like people, you on the one hand, sometimes things are, I wish the truth weren't so complicated. Sometimes it is, but you want to have influence. And there are those people who are good popularizing themselves, but some people are not so good. I mean, so Du Bois was good. He could write, a 700-page Black Reconstruction, but he could also write an article and get to, Marx not so good at it. He has Engels is pretty good popularizer. So, but some of us shouldn't really be in that business of trying to popularize ourselves. There are better writers and better communicators who can get those ideas out there in a way that's digestible to people who don't have the time and education to kind of sit with the thing in the way that we do. But that doesn't make it not worth doing. It just you have to expect that others will take that up, and they often do.
Yeah, and I certainly think that's in the spirit of Rawls, because he did not himself, as Reiner mentioned, see himself as a public intellectual, even though, in fact, many people tried to turn him into one. And his influence was more indirect, but therefore, I would say, more powerful, ultimately.
I would really resist, though, what I see as a false dichotomy that's being put forward here between being a kind of philosopher on the one hand and being a public intellectual. I mean, I don't think that you can characterize Hobbes as a public intellectual. He was a serious philosopher, but he saw the educative dimension of politics as being essentially part of politics. That is what it is to think about politics. And I just say, I like the fact that Rawls wasn't, the flogging himself around being a public intellectual like people I am. But I like that. But I also think that there's a risk of, in teaching Rawls to students, that we begin to make a virtue of what I think what he himself would have seen as a weakness or a vice in his own presentation. And there's the importance of thinking. I mean, so one thing, Tommy, you said was you're more interested in his approach to questions rather in the man than in the man himself. But one thing we're doing when we're teaching is we're putting forward particular people, particular flesh and blood human beings who thought in the world at a particular time, in a particular space, putting them forward as a kind of exemplary kind of person, in an exemplary kind of life. This is a life worth choosing or thinking about choosing. This is a possibility. And so I would say it's you can't forget that.
Yeah.
I think that you can't, but I mean, as an undergraduate, I love Nietzsche for precisely that reason. It's an attractive kind of life.
So we are just at the point that I had hoped we would reach, that is, in conclusion, inconclusiveness. The panel has been terrific and entered into this in just the right spirit, but now we'll see if you can enter into this in just the right spirit. I was going to start with students, if they survived this far. But I'll define student broadly as someone who needs still to learn a lot, and therefore I'm going to call on Michael Rosen first. Microphone.
Thank you very much, Michael Rosen. People have kindly thanked me for organising this conference. Thanks to you, I'm convinced that I did a great job, but it's you rather than me. But I have one qualification for organising a conference on rules, which is that actually my own views on rules are quite ambivalent. I am torn and attracted at the same time. I'm attracted and repelled. And thank you, Teresa, because for the first day and a half of this conference, 2 days, listening to advocates of rules, I was finding myself feeling increasingly alienated from rules. You, by your last contribution, have brought me back to him. And so I'd like to respond to you by responding to your question. How do I teach rules? I have been teaching rules for a long time, and with great enthusiasm on my part, and sometimes even on the part of my students, I think. And my understanding of teaching is a simple, traditional, very Oxonian, perhaps not so Canterbridgian one, which is Socratic. I try and engage with where people are, ask questions, make things difficult where they seem to be easy, make suggestions about where things might be seen differently. It's not a very original view of teaching, but it's one which I subscribe to very deeply. And in that context, the first thing that I teach, we haven't heard that phrase in the last 2.5 days, and it's really strange. Tim Scanlon says somewhere, immortally, reflective equilibrium is not just the best way of doing moral philosophy, it's the only way of doing moral philosophy. Derek Parfit quotes it approvingly, and if I may move to a lower level, I totally agree with that. So reflective equilibrium is at least part of it. Now, why is this such a big deal? It's a big deal because one of the reasons that political philosophy was in the lamentable state that it was that it was at a time when people had a kind of positivistic view that there really wasn't much to be done because the fact-value distinction, which most people believed in, was such that basically you're just going to pick your politics, aren't you? So what can we do as political philosophers? Well, we can do one of two things. Either, and what people mostly did, was a kind of mélange of fairly amateurish history and fairly superficial conceptual analysis, or, and this was the utilitarians and particularly the economist utilitarians, try and assume falsely that you could get to substantive political conclusions from mere considerations about rational decision theory. So, this looked to most people to be a very unappetizing alternative. Rawls made the extraordinary, brave suggestion and followed through on it that one can create a systematic political theory of a non-foundational character using the method of reflective equilibrium. So that's the first thing I hope to teach to students, which is even if you don't agree with Rawls, isn't it useful to try and think about things in the method of reflective equilibrium? And this, Rawls like Kant, if you don't learn anything from Kant, surely you should learn that you don't put really, really important methodological considerations in the last 50 pages of a 500-page, 450-page, whatever it is, book. But Rawls does that in his concluding stuff on methodology, which most people never get to, and that's exactly what Kant does in the Critique of Pure Reason. Anyway, but that's so getting people to skip to that part of the book is another thing that I think we need to teach. A second thing that I want to teach, and again, is a very broad historical thought, one which may seem obvious to us now, but it's only thanks to Rawls that it again seems obvious, which is that political philosophy is distinctive and not merely applied moral philosophy. So the first time I teach Rawls, I try and teach him in a line that goes back to Hobbes, because Hobbes, whom I admire much less than Teresa, at least had one thing to be said in his favor. He at least drew the conclusion that you couldn't just assume a shared moral, ethical, and religious and metaphysical framework to give normative foundations to politics. And what I try and show students is that in some sense that outline is a truth. The third thing that I teach students is the distinction between pure, imperfect, and perfect procedural justice. It's a marvelous piece of analytical political philosophy because it does the very best thing that analytical political philosophy can ever do, which is not just say, oh, you know, here are some distinctions. Oh, thank you, some distinctions. I've shown you differences, says Wittgenstein. Well, yes, but there are a lot of differences out there. Have you shown me differences that have any kind of use for me? Yes, indeed. Because you can show, particularly the idea of imperfect procedural justice, the idea that things may be just as institutions while having unjust outcomes, and that there are justifications for that. That's a very, I must say, when I learnt it, I thought, goodness gracious me, why had I never thought of that before? I'm sure all of you had thought of it before you encountered it in rules, but that was just me. And some of my students are kind enough to say that they had never thought of that before. But it's a very, very important thing. And it's also very, very important for the flip-flopping that I've done over the many years about how far we should convict rules of being just in the shadow of the American polity. No one could read rules and say he has no criticisms of America. The question is, what are the status of those criticisms? And this is to take up something that Tommy might have said. The question is, how imperfect can it be and still be just? Because if it's imperfectly just, it's like someone's convicted someone wrongly. We should protest. We should campaign for release. But we shouldn't be burning down the jail. We shouldn't be trying to set up a new system of justice. We should simply be aware. Now, I can't find anything in rules that suggests that he thinks that American injustice is sufficiently remote from justice to justify radical political action against it. So when Reiner says, well, it's far, far away, how far away is it? Is it far away in the way that convicting an innocent person is far away, or is it far away in the way in which forcing people to live under a repressive regime is far away? So I flip-flopped on this over the years, and I have come back to my youthful, naive view that it is indeed a pertinent criticism of rules, that he does not, he underplays and understates the acute injustice in his own society. And that applies, in my view, particularly to the things that he says and the things that he doesn't say about foreign policy and about race. So thank you, Teresa, for reminding me of how attracted I am to rules, but I also have to record some limitations.
Well, I would just say that the quotation I read from that lecture in 1960, I think, is support for your reading that he doesn't go far, that he thinks that the American regime as it exists is closer to just than we might wish.
Reiner?
Just 2 points. Though this would be a longer discussion, and I'm glad, Michael, that we do have it. Reflective equilibrium, for me, is a wonderful method to clarify issues, questions, and possible answers. It is not a method to provide answers. That I don't see. Because, you just find something out about your intuitions, you find something out about in wide reflective equilibrium, the range of theoretical approaches, and then you try to work out a principled view. So this is a great heuristic to have, but which theory you think is the most appealing to that issue is in that method, not predetermined. So is Rawls's theory a non-foundational theory? I don't think so. The reflective equilibrium is non-foundational. But look, in his writings, there are a number of passages, and one of them is in Political Liberalism, where he discusses Michael Walzer. He says, we turn to political philosophy when our shared political understandings, as Walzer might say, break down, and equally when we're torn within ourselves. And the example, then, that he gives is Alexander Stevens rejecting Lincoln's appeal to the abstraction of natural right and replying to him by saying, the North must respect the South's shared political understandings on the slavery question. And Rawls comments, surely the reply to this will lead into political philosophy. And this is not a non-foundationalist who speaks here.
Well, it depends. Going deeper. It depends what you mean by foundations.
Right.
But it's not a political philosophy, as I understand it, in which someone could say to someone who doesn't believe, for instance, in human dignity, who doesn't believe that there is some equal, if we juxtapose Kant and Aristotle who thinks some people are naturally slaves,
Right.
That caricature of Aristotle, and Kant who thinks we all have the transcendental inner kernel. Now, you may be perhaps right. Rawls believes not only is Kant on the right side, but that Kant is right.
Yes.
But there is no method by which, in my reading of Rawls, any Kantian can demonstrate. I'm so sorry. I've been haranguing people to use the microphone, and here I am omitting this. I'm merely shouting. As I understand it, and I could be wrong, there is nothing in Rawls which would, even though, of course, it's not committed to anti-realism. You can very well be a realist, but there is no method, as I see it, to get to the moral fact, say the moral fact that people really are, that they really do possess, as Rawls says, an inviolability based on justice. To someone who denies that and says that justice consists in that justice consists in them occupying their place within a wider order. Between those two people, I don't think reflective equilibrium gives you any way of choosing, right. and that something similar may well apply in the case of slavery.
Reflective equilibrium doesn't. That's what I mean. But his Kantianism and the way he reconstructs what Kantianism means gives an answer.
Ah, well, there we disagree.
Well, I think we'll move on.
Right, I think it would be good to have an actual
Yeah,
student.
right. Yeah. Thank you, Michael, for joining our panel. I appreciate that.
Dennis, Richard up there is a student.
Yes.
That's all right.
Yeah.
Richard Wang. I'm the editor-in-chief of the famous Harvard Review of Philosophy.
Yeah, I apologize. I didn't realize you were still.
So my question is addressed for the panel, although I'm stating this question in response to Professor Forst's remarks about Kant's central role in Rawls' political philosophy. What does Rawls reveal about the appropriate relationship between moral and political philosophy? Certainly his approach, which some have termed political moralism, has been widely influential in political philosophy ever since. But I'm wondering if we could reflect on the virtues or perhaps defects of the central role of moral philosophy, and in particular, sort of like Kantian influence in his political philosophy.
Do you want to start on that?
I will try a brief answer. Though this is a large question, I'm glad you asked it. When I said he uses the structure and the core of a Kantian idea of autonomy, and that is moral autonomy, for constructing the principles of a basic structure which will be a legal, political, and social structure, you have that issue opening up right there. Namely, you have a moral argument for institutions and principles of institutions which will be guiding and valid for people who are not moral angels, who have a capacity for moral understanding and a sense of justice, but have their rational plans of life and have their self-interests. And I think one of the fascinating things about Rawls is that he tried to unite what Kant separated, namely moral philosophy and legal philosophy. You know, legal philosophy is you know, for a society of possible devils, and you have to have a certain institutional structure and certain ideas of legal institutions of legal justice in place. Now, Rawls tried to combine the two. The principles of the basic structure have to speak to those who ask a serious moral question about them and have to appeal to those who don't. And I think that the criticism that either Rawls is too moralistic or that he made too many compromises with social reality, I understand these criticisms, but I think you have to appreciate that he was breaking new ground in trying to devise a middle road between the two, and I think that is a truly innovative approach. When I called it a pure theory of justice, of course I had Kelsen's pure theory of law in mind. So this is the anti-positivist program. But a theory of justice cannot be a program for thoroughly morally oriented people walking through a modern complex society, constantly asking themselves what they should do morally speaking. So it's a huge task for that theory. And I'm not saying it's successful in every way. When we talked about the difference principle and how much room the difference principle allows for self-interested use of the institutions that conform to the principle, you know, Cohen's question, you see this, how this comes up. But I still think that is the way in which we should ask the question of political and social justice. It is a moral question, but the answer can't be a purely moral one. It has to be an institutional one.
I'll just say that if you go to the archive and check out the early drafts of A Theory of Justice, you'll see that Rawls initially intended it to be published with an epigraph from Rousseau's Emile on precisely this issue. So happy hunting.
The next issue of the Harvard Review of Philosophy. She's already written it for you. Now, we have about 20 minutes, I think, not more than that. And I will now invite comments from any of you. Michael Rosen is a model of thinking, but not commenting, because he, as the organizer of the conference, he has license to do what I hope not everybody else will be doing. So, Paul, you had a question. And remember to wait for the microphone and identify yourself.
Paul Weithman. Two quick, what I hope will be quick points about the systematicity of the view. One point concerns the original position, and I'm always sorry when I hear skepticism about it or hear it maligned in the way that Teresa says it is, rightly says it is often maligned, because I think we shouldn't lose sight, either when we teach it or when we think about it, about just what a beautiful intellectual device it is. I mean, that Rawls should begin by distinguishing the right and the good so sharply, and then use the same intellectual device to identify principles of right and to identify principles which are such that when we act from them, we express our nature and thereby realize a great good. You should have developed this device that can bridge the distinction that he drew. Is really a marvelous intellectual achievement. And I think it contributes greatly to the systematicity of theory of justice. And so when I teach theory of justice, I teach it beginning to end, just so that they can see the original position in both its uses. The other point about the systematicity is a question for Rainer, and it's about the first impurity that you identified. And I take it that your thought or your worry about the first impurity went something like this. The overlapping consensus suggests that the conceptions that the overlapping consensus suggests that the comprehensive views that support the conception lend the conception its normative force, but we need a freestanding conception to have normative force in its own right, because it's only if it does that people who act on the conception can act autonomously. Right. So So here's another way of thinking about things, which you probably won't like, but I want to get your reaction to it.
Oh, I like everything you suggest.
Oh, thank you.
Even if it's not true. Even if it's not true.
And the other way of thinking about things is this, that political liberalism doesn't try to salvage autonomy the way you think about it. Rather, in everyday life, in a society with an overlapping consensus, many law-abiding people who take part in the overlapping consensus don't act autonomously, precisely because they act from principles for the reasons their comprehensive doctrine provides. But what political liberalism does is just make sure that a different perspective on our lives is available, that we can, if we like, see ourselves as citizens, and see ourselves as acting autonomously in that capacity, even if day in and day out we don't.
Right.
So, Teresa, on the original position, the assault thereon?
I don't think there's any disagreement between us here, but it's a question of, for me, it was a pedagogical question. But I think teaching things that are beautiful for the sake of beauty and really emphasizing a theory of justice as a whole is very much the way to teach it. And I think one of the wonderful things that's come out of this conference is precisely this taking it seriously as a whole and focusing on part 3. But again, my concern is how, how Rawlsian political philosophy is taught and received by the kind of highly ambitious students that I encounter in PPE at Oxford, who then go off to the halls of power in a very concrete way, and good for them. But I do think that we have questions about the ethics of how we present the philosophy in a way that can actually be grasped in the time that they have.
I read PPE at Oxford, and I ended up here on this hapless role
The halls
as a
of power.
moderator. Yeah, there's no power up here, as I quickly discovered. Reiner, did you want to?
Yeah, just briefly, Paul, this is a longer discussion, and I'm glad we will be able to continue.
I'm sorry, really?
No.
Okay.
To continue it, the reason why I think there has to be an autonomous validity of the conception of justice is that in moments of conflict between your comprehensive doctrine and what you owe to others in terms of the conception of justice, the latter has to take priority. If the finesses of our societies have a majority in the Supreme Court and would like to push through laws according to their Christian faith against institutionalizing same-sex marriage, they should not, they ought not, and they must not. And to understand this, even if it goes against the deepest grain of their faith, to understand this, you need to understand what the autonomous power of a conception of justice means. And to criticize them, if they don't act accordingly, you have to understand it too.
Eric? Yes. Microphone, please.
I'm going to avail myself of Dennis's
Eric
permission.
Nelson.
Yeah, sorry, Eric Nelson. Just to make a comment, to which I invite, of course, your reflections and comments, but it's not in the form of a question. It's really just about this question that came up about the relationship between the sort of historical project of contextualizing roles and the philosophical project of teaching and understanding him. And in a way, it relates to the very fine question we had from the editor of our famous philosophy review. So what I want to say is this, since it's something I've thought a bit about, I would myself be very disappointed if I thought that the implication or let alone the purpose of historicizing roles was in some way either to domesticate him, to consign him to just the stack of texts that we ought to think about, or even just to do what, of course, it should be able to do, the salutary sort of work that Teresa was mentioning about sort of deparochializing or pointing out some of the parochialism and explaining it, not just of the the sort of immediately political kind, but even of the sort of more structurally philosophical kind. That is, Michael began the conference by pointing out, this is a book that has dozens of pages telling you what Pareto optimality is, and a couple of paragraphs telling you what the priority of liberty means. And you might think that's strange until you know something about the milieu in which he was writing and thinking. And so you might actually gain some purchase on all of this by proceeding somewhat contextually. But I'd go further, and that's really the sort of heft of my comment. I think that the point, for me anyway, not the only point, but for me the most important point, of trying to recover the character of Rawls's intellectual formation is precisely the philosophical value that project could have for our engagement with the text on its philosophical merits. And just to point out, two examples, because one we've been circling around, this issue of Rawls's Kantianism, right? So this comes up all the time. It's a famous question. It's a vexed question, right? It's a question, I think, that is aided philosophically, not just historically, by the awareness that Rawls came to Kant very late, as we now know, as Katrina's work has shown, Kenzie's, my own, to a lesser degree, that actually the younger Rawls was deeply unhappy with Kant for lots of very important reasons, and that many, if not most, of the structural, essential, foundational ideas of the theory of justice were worked out before Rawls cast them as in any way Kantian. Now, I think that's philosophically as well as just historically important. The other that I'd mention, maybe closer to home for me, is we've been talking quite a lot over the last few days about this distinctive conception of persons that Rawls has, and that various of our panelists have been defending and even trying to deepen in many ways, whereby persons are to be regarded as overwhelmingly, if not entirely, determined in their life plans and choices by circumstances beyond their control. It's a view of human agency I myself find very unattractive, as I also find unattractive the thought that we treat people respectfully in civic association by attributing to them that sort of wholly determined persona. But that's just me. What I'm interested in is why Rawls thought that, and how that conception ramifies in the way that it does within the theory, often in strange ways. And my own thought, or what I've managed rightly or wrongly to persuade myself of, is that there is a contextual religious explanation for that pattern of ideas, and that's philosophically important. So, again, my point isn't to shill for my particular reading of these two issues in Rawls. It's just to say that I wouldn't want us to come up with this very brittle distinction between the historicizing and the philosophical, the kind of archaizing and the sort of useful Rawls, because that's not my conception at all of how these things ought to go together. So.
I agree with you, but can I just jump in and colonize this completely? I'm sorry. Look, the question when Rawls came to Kant is a complicated question. Even if he came to appreciate his philosophy only in the course of the 60s, that doesn't mean that it plays less of a role in a theory of justice. But look, I'm with you and Teresa to look at a complex philosophical author like Rawls in a genealogical way. And if you look at, and here the work of the colleagues is extremely important, if you look at a certain trajectory of ideas from his early writings, such as his early thesis that has been published, The Critique of the Good Life, the Lutheran conception of morality as being your categorical duty without reward, you can understand how someone formed in that religious mold would, whenever he seriously encounters Kant's philosophy, see the point of the categorical imperative So we can read this author in many ways. We can read and understand him even if we have no clue about the Lutheran, deep structure of Kant's thought. But if you're interested as a historian, that is an obvious way. And I was just opening my phone because I made a photograph from Rawls's, from the exhibition, Rawls's annotations of Kant's piece on religion. And when Kant argues, well, we have a propensity to evil, but we have a disposition towards the good. Anlage zum Guten, aber ein Hang zum Bösen. So the disposition is the ground. The other is the constant temptation. Rawls writes in red, we cannot be totally corrupted. Exclamation mark. Think about it. This is, that Kantianism runs so deep. I remember in California when we had this conference shortly before his first stroke, Bernard Williams provoked him with a lot of Nietzschean realist counter arguments, and at one point Rawls says what he also writes at various passages, like in The Law of Peoples. He says with Kant, if human beings were such that they were not capable of doing justice, there would be no reason why they should populate the face of the earth.
Did you want to?
Just maybe two quick things. I don't. Just to make sure I wasn't misunderstood. I think being I'm teaching now. It's my 19th year in teaching in Department of African American Studies. One of the things I've come away with that has been great is that I think a lot of philosophers don't get to experience is being in a multidisciplinary context kind of all the time. And so you've come to a certain kind of appreciation of different ways of going at a text, right? So we could have the same text. People go at it in lots of different ways, and you realize the question of how to go at it, methodologically, how you got to approach it, depends on the question you're trying to ask. So, and that's one of the things I don't mean to be policing. I think there's lots of different things you can do with reading a theory of justice or political liberalism, lots of different, or reading his archives or what have you. Lots of different questions you could be trying to ask, and depending on the question, you might draw on different tools. Now, of course, if I thought like in order for me to come away with the most illuminating reading of the thing, if I thought like I need to know this fact about that, when did he come to Kant? I mean, maybe I misunderstood something. Well, that would be a problem, right? If I'm trying to understand what he's up to, how the argument goes, if I need to know that. So insofar as it's a bit of historical information that will help me better grapple with the text, and of course I want to know it. So I didn't mean to be suggesting otherwise if it seemed like it was.
We have time for one more question, I'm afraid, only one more. And Danielle had indicated. No.
Thank you. Well, in that case, I'll just take a moment, too, to thank my colleagues, Emiliano and Maggie and JC, wherever he went, and also just when you go out, Vicky and Jess. I mean, a few got thanked last night, but there have been a lot of people helping, so if you can say thank you as you pass out, I'd be very good. There's JC, thank you. So the question was, I just wanted to come back to your comment, Dennis, about the Rawls having a deeply democratic notion of the purpose of philosophy, and just spend another little minute thinking about that. And partly by way of a just small comment to make a defense, in fact, of his literary accomplishment, speaking of sort of the different kinds of purposes. So I think, like lots of people, I used to think that Theory of Justice was basically not a good example of writing in the history of political philosophy. And I've come to think of it as a superlative example, and precisely actually in a democratic way. When you're out about the world in policymaking circles and so forth, that basically the veil of ignorance, original position, difference principle are the only nuggets of philosophy you ever encounter, period. That's it. Like, there's just nothing else. Every now and then, like, and a little bit of Aristotelian, man's a social being or something like that. Mostly it's just those three things. Why is that? It's because of how the book is constructed, and because you get the whole thing easily accessible up front. And then it's appealing enough that it's an invitation. And every bit more you get is a bit more of the invitation until finally at the end you get to the methodology if you've accepted the invitation all along the way. And at that point you've been invited into kind of the sort of big project political philosophy, but you've been invited into it in the ways that democratic citizens need to be upfront, which is to say, to have had your capacity for some degree of abstract thinking strengthened, which like democratic citizens need, because democracy is like fundamentally rests on a set of abstractions, but we don't actually get it very often. So at any rate, I just thought, Dennis, your question or your comment was a nice frame for thinking about Rawls's importance, and I would love to have the commentators, spend another little minute thinking about how they would think of the deeply democratic notion of the purpose of philosophy in Rawls. Is that a fair accounting? How would you say what that consisted of if you were pursuing that description?
A good question, if they could answer briefly. Do you want to start, Tommy?
It's difficult. Well, I mean, Rawls does say, I mean, he doesn't think of political philosophy as kind of like totally outside of politics in a way, right? It's a kind of thing that we all can do. Some people obviously, do it in a more sophisticated way than others, but so in that way, I think I was endorsing the way that you would suggesting to read him as attempting to engage the public, and it's not just a purely academic kind of exercise. That philosophy is a thing that anybody with the willingness to sit and think carefully through a thing with others in an open-minded way can benefit from. So I think that was the ethos.
I think, apart from what I said so far, I think if you read A Theory of Justice, you hear not just a lot of very interesting arguments, you hear a person speaking. You hear someone who is, and that links up to what I meant, there was a religious temperament to Rawls even after he had stopped being religious. You see, you feel a seriousness about the project, which I think puts some people off, which think this is too moralistic. But I think it draws you in. You see that there is someone here grappling with a huge question in an extremely humane, seriously, and morally guided way.
Yeah, I would pick up on what Reiner just said about the humanity and the humaneness of Rawls's project and also Rawls's voice. I mean, that's something I think about the beginning of Justice's Fairness Restatement, and I think a lot of people are quite unhappy with the conciliatory approach to political philosophy that he puts there, but that part of the purpose of political philosophy is reconciling ourselves to the world. And I think that is something that has maybe been lost in a lot of what we think of doing political philosophy in a Rawlsian way, and partly it's because people worry about that as a kind of reconciling ourselves to injustice, but I think that his insight there is a kind of humane insight of inhabiting the world with others that I think is, profound and worth foregrounding.
Good. This panel has exceeded my expectations, and that's not to say that I don't have high expectations to begin with. Very interesting, and your questions were as well. It does bring us to the conclusion of the concluding panel, though there are concluding remarks in just a minute, Michael. I do want to... there's been a lot of thanks, but mostly it's been perspective. But now we can retrospectively thank a number of people for for what has happened, not what will happen. This conference, and it's Michael has been thanked, and Danielle and Ludek and the staff and all of the panelists and our two wonderful keynote speakers. We haven't, except tangentially, thanked one person, and at the risk of raising theological issues beyond my competence, we should be thanking John Rawls, whose spirit, if not person, this conference is amply demonstrated, is very much alive. And it's thanks to all of you who participated in this wonderful adventure in the last 2 days and a half that he is in spirit very much alive. So thank you, and thanks for your time.
You'll be very relieved to know that my concluding remarks are going to be incredibly brief, because I know that we've got to that stage of the conference when everyone's sick of the sound of anyone's voice except their own. And I'm actually getting pretty sick of mine too. So I did want, and for that reason, I extended my thanks, which are very warm and very deep, right at the beginning of the conference. Perhaps I could just add now congratulations, which is that to all of those who worked so hard. I do hope that, like me, you feel that your efforts have been very, very, very worthwhile. So that is all that I shall say at this that time. But there are a couple of things I want to say. First of all, it's been a remarkable event. But when we went into thinking about this event, we were clear that however memorable it should be, it shouldn't be something which just comes to a conclusion as we now pour ourselves gratefully out into the restaurants and in some cases bars of Cambridge, but something that looks forward. So as the speakers and panelists know, we do intend to produce a published form of this event. We're going to be able to see and relive and in some cases admire, many cases admire what has been transpired during these 3 days, because they've been recorded and they will be placed in the public domain. But I want also to encourage you, if like me, I went through the conference at some times and like someone who was like a man on a diet who is being paraded in front of a cake shop, because I felt these wonderful, interesting ideas are being passed before me, but actually I'm just at present not quite able to take them in. So if you, like me, feel that there are things you would have liked to have said because you didn't have the opportunity, or perhaps because, like me, you were simply too exhausted to properly engage with them, I want to encourage you among yourselves and with us to continue the conversation. Email these days well exists, and I do hope that it will be something which, particularly for the younger members of this panel, will fructify conversations for a long time to come. But there was also something else which I regretted. I sort of expected. I had lunch with Tim Scanlon earlier this week. That's how I know that he was in Hong Kong and how burdened he was and how heroic he has been in taking such an active part in this conference. We're immensely grateful to him for that. And he started telling me one or two stories, and as always, they were as illuminating as they were entertaining. And he said, "Oh, forgive me, I'm in my anecdotage." And I said, "Not at all. I find your anecdotes absolutely marvelous. Perhaps you'd like to share some with us during the conference." "Oh, no, not at all. I'd hate to do that," said he. And of course, he gave us the reason not to, which is that perhaps those younger people who didn't have the good fortune to know Jack Rawls themselves would feel in some way put down, embarrassed, or inhibited. I'm not sure that would have been the case, and I hope that if I share one anecdote with you, you won't find it, at least at this stage of the conference, it's certainly not supposed to indicate any superiority, but it does seem to me, it came back to my mind as I was listening to this excellent discussion on the last panel, but it also seemed to me to epitomize something that we've been trying to do over the last 3 days. So Dennis evoked the experience, which was apparently common at Harvard, of people presenting work in political philosophy which interpreted Rawls and drew upon him in Rawls's presence. I had that experience. It was at a conference in Oxford. And young as I was, brash as I was absolutely terrified. I didn't know what I was going to do. So I prefaced my remarks by telling a well-known story. It's about two musicians. I think nowadays that it's attributed to Rosalind Turek and Wanda Landowska, both very formidable musicians in their, and formidable ladies in their way. And Turek said to Landowska, "You play Bach your way, but I play Bach Bach's way." And I like to think that the two things that we've been doing over these last 3 days have been ways of trying to bring those two things together. And I hope that as we go away, you'll agree with me that that's been a very, very fruitful thing to do. So thank you all.